Hello and welcome back to the English with Kit podcast. So, in today's episode, I'm going to talk about one of my favourite places in the world and one of the most famous historic sites in the UK, the Tower of London. We're going to go on a virtual tour around the Tower of London, and we're going to explore some of the most famous buildings and sites at the Tower of London. I'll also share some stories of some of the Tower's most fascinating and famous prisoners. In April this year, I actually had the opportunity to visit the Tower of London for the very first time. And I was so excited about this visit because I have been a history buff pretty much my whole life. Since I was very little, I have loved history, especially Tudor history. So yeah, this visit was very exciting for me. And it was this visit that inspired me to create this podcast episode. And I really hope you enjoy it. At the end of the episode, I'll explain some key vocabulary, expressions, and phrases from the episode. And you'll find this list of vocabulary on my website, englishwithkit.com. I will also upload the transcript of this episode to my website. So, without further ado, let's get started with our trip through time to the Tower of London. The Tower of London is a fortress located in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, which is on the north bank of the River Thames. William the Conqueror, the Norman king who invaded England, decided in 1066 to build the Tower of London as a symbol of his power. In 1078, William the Conqueror built the White Tower, which is situated in the centre of the Tower of London. The White Tower is definitely the most recognisable and iconic part of the Tower of London. So the White Tower is a keep. Okay, it was designed to be a keep. If you're not familiar with the different parts of an English castle, a keep is traditionally the strongest part of the castle, designed to provide protection to the residents of the castle and the soldiers if an enemy attacked the castle. However, the White Tower was used for many different purposes. In addition to being a keep, the White Tower was also used as a royal residence for kings and queens to stay in. And it was used as an armoury. An armoury is the part of the castle where armour and weapons are stored. Although the White Tower was not designed to be a prison, it has on occasion been used as a prison. One of the most famous prisoners who was kept in the White Tower was called Ranulph Flambard. Ranulph Flambard was imprisoned in the White Tower in the year 1100 because he had been accused of embezzlement. However, Flambard became the first person in history to escape the Tower of London by climbing down a rope. He returned to Normandy in France and survived. So he was very lucky because for most prisoners, it was impossible to escape the Tower of London. So Ranulph Lambert is very special in that regard. Now let's explore some of the buildings around the White Tower because, as I mentioned, the White Tower is in the centre, in the middle, and it's surrounded by several other buildings. When you enter the Tower of London and head towards the White Tower, you will pass by the Bloody Tower. According to legend, the boys we know today as the princes in the tower, brothers Edward V and Richard, who were aged 12 and 9 at the time, were imprisoned in the Bloody Tower. The young princes mysteriously disappeared around 1483. And some believe they were murdered by their uncle, Richard III, who became king after the prince's father's death. So some believe they died in the Tower of London. However, there is no proof of that, and the mystery has never been solved. Some believe they may have escaped or been smuggled out of the tower, but it's likely we will never know for sure. Another famous prisoner who was kept in the Bloody Tower was Walter Raleigh. Walter Raleigh was an explorer and a writer who was a favourite of Queen Elizabeth I. This means he was a close companion to Elizabeth I. She really enjoyed his company. So Elizabeth was fond of Raleigh because he was handsome, charismatic, and of course he had plenty of stories to tell about his travels. By the time he met Elizabeth I, he had already been to North America on an expedition. So, of course, he was very interesting as a person. Walter Raleigh is known for organising expeditions to North America. And he's also known for trying and failing to colonise I'm probably pronouncing it terribly. I believe it's Roanoke Island, which is now North Carolina in the United States. In addition, though he didn't personally discover tobacco on his travels, it is said that he made smoking tobacco popular at Elizabeth I's court. Unfortunately for Walter Raleigh, Elizabeth's successor, the man who became king after she died, James I, had him imprisoned in the Bloody Tower at the Tower of London because James believed that Raleigh may have plotted against him. Raleigh spent 13 years at the Tower of London, but he lived relatively comfortably at the Tower of London because he was a very well-known prisoner with plenty of money. So he did not live in a cell or in bad conditions. He lived in quite good conditions compared to some of the other prisoners. During his stay at the Tower of London, Raleigh had a lot of time, of course, and he spent this time planting seeds from all around the world, seeds he had collected during his travels. And he wrote the book called The History of the World. In the year 1616, James decided to release Walter Raleigh from the prison and send him on an expedition. But when Raleigh came back to England, James decided to execute him after all. So things did not end well for Walter Raleigh. Raleigh is one of 7 people who were actually executed inside the Tower walls. Most people were executed just outside the Tower walls on Tower Hill, which today is just across the street from the Tower of London. When you pass the Bloody Tower, you will see the White Tower ahead of you, surrounded by Tower Green. Here, on the grass or sitting on the steps leading up to the White Tower, you might catch a glimpse of the famous Tower Ravens. The Tower Ravens are large black birds that have been kept at the Tower of London for hundreds of years. According to legend, if the ravens leave the Tower of London, it will collapse. And this is why there are always at least 6 ravens at the Tower of London. So when I visited, I heard some people saying that they find the ravens ugly or creepy because they're often associated with darkness and death. But I personally find them beautiful. I saw 2 ravens sitting on the steps leading up to the White Tower, and I was really impressed by their size and beauty. I had seen photos of ravens before, but I didn't realize they were quite as big as the ones that I saw that day. Ravens are also said to be great problem solvers and to have a talent for mimicking sounds. But they're also very territorial, so it's best to avoid touching or feeding them when you visit the Tower of London. In addition to the ravens, you will also see people in red and dark blue uniforms walking around the Tower grounds. These are the yeoman warders, and they are the Tower guards. The yeoman warders are sometimes called beefeaters. In King Henry VIII's time, the yeoman warders were Henry's personal guards, and it was during this time that they started guarding the Tower of London. Battlements, which are the high walls around a castle that soldiers could shoot from if there was an attack, run around the Tower of London. You can walk on the battlements to get an amazing view of the city and the River Thames, but also to visit some of the towers that were used as royal apartments or prisons. In some of these towers along the battlements, you may even spot graffiti scratched into the walls by prisoners hundreds of years ago. This includes graffiti left behind by 2 of the gunpowder plotters, Everard Digby and Ambrose Rookwood, who had planned to blow up the Houses of Parliament in 1605. Most people remember Guy Fawkes as the guy who was in charge of the gunpowder plot, But in fact, he was just one of the members. He was not the leader of the plot. The leader was actually a man called Robert Catesby. Guy Fawkes was also kept prisoner at the Tower of London, but I don't think there is any graffiti by him, as far as I know. There is plenty more graffiti, however, in the Beauchamp Tower, where many prisoners were held over the years. For me, seeing this graffiti was the most moving part of my visit, because I actually recognized many of the names that I saw on the walls, and it was amazing to me to think that these people actually sat in their cell here in the tower and took the time to carve their name into the walls. It was really a reminder that although today these people are just names you see on a wall, they were real people with real stories. And this is what I found the most touching. The Beauchamp Tower, which is near to the entrance of the tower, has a big display inside telling the stories of the many prisoners who were unlucky enough to end up in the tower. Some of them, like Walter Raleigh, lived quite comfortably at the Tower of London despite being prisoners. Unfortunately, some prisoners, especially those accused of treason, lived in much worse conditions with no comforts whatsoever. For these prisoners, the days at the tower would have been long and incredibly stressful. According to historic royal palaces, prisoners left graffiti as a way to pass the time and leave a legacy so they wouldn't be forgotten. One of the most famous people kept prisoner at the Tower of London, and the person who interests me most of all, was Queen Anne Boleyn, and she was the second wife of King Henry VIII. Anne had been accused of adultery, incest, and treason against her husband, though most historians think it's very unlikely that she was guilty. The evidence against Anne was very weak, but she was nevertheless sentenced to death. Anne was not imprisoned in a cell, however. As she was the Queen of England, she was kept in the Tower's royal apartments, which were luxuriously furnished. These apartments don't exist anymore, but they used to sit close to the jewel house, where the crown jewels and other precious jewels are still kept today. And of course, you can see those if you visit. But I remember that you are not allowed to take photographs in there. So that's just something to bear in mind. Anyway, Anne Boleyn was beheaded at the Tower of London on the 19th of May, 1536, just 17 days after her arrest. Anne made a very brave speech from the scaffold and impressed the crowd with her courage. Anne had one small comfort in her last moments, and that was that a French expert swordsman had come to perform the execution, so it would be over very quickly. Near the Beauchamp Tower, the tower we talked about just before, there is a memorial to Anne and the 6 other people who were executed within the Tower of London. The memorial is a glass scaffold, and it sits just in front of the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, where Anne was buried after her execution. A few years later, Henry VIII's 5th wife and cousin to Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, faced the same fate as Anne. Accused of adultery, she was also beheaded at the Tower of London. She was only around 19 years old at the time. Like Anne Boleyn, Catherine was buried in the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, as was Lady Jane Grey, who was Queen of England for just 9 days and was executed at just 16 years old. Several years later, Anne Boleyn's daughter, Princess Elizabeth Tudor, was also imprisoned in the Tower of London for a while. Her sister, Queen Mary I of England, suspected Elizabeth of plotting to take her throne. Like her mother, Elizabeth stayed in the royal apartments during her stay at the Tower. She was released after 2 months and went on to become Queen Elizabeth I of England, and she ruled for 40 years. And that brings us to the end of this episode. And I hope you enjoyed learning about the incredible Tower of London. Now I'm going to explain some of the key vocabulary from the episode. But before we get into that, I'd just like to say thank you so much for listening. It would be great if you could please comment, like, and subscribe if you enjoyed this episode and would like to learn more about famous places and people in English history. I am planning to create more episodes around this theme. So now let's take a look at the vocabulary. In this episode, I used the collocation history buff. You might remember I said I've been a history buff since childhood. A buff is someone who knows a lot about a specific topic or is very interested in a specific topic. In this case, history. However, you can use this collocation with other activities. For example, if you're good at languages, you might say, I'm a language buff. If you're very knowledgeable about films and cinema, you might say, I'm a film buff or I'm a cinema buff. So it can be used in many ways. You also heard the noun embezzlement. The verb form is to embezzle. Embezzlement is a form of corporate fraud. It means to take money from your employer and use it in a way you are not supposed to. For example, if an employee is trusted with money from the company and instead uses it to buy a new car, for example, for themselves, that is a form of embezzlement. It's like stealing from the company. In this episode, we also heard the phrase, to catch a glimpse. To catch a glimpse of something means to see something or get a look at something. For example, if you visit the battlements at the Tower of London, you might catch a glimpse of prisoner graffiti that has been there for hundreds of years. And finally, we also heard the verb to spot, or to spot something, which also means to see something. For example, if we take the same example as I just mentioned, if you visit the battlements, you might spot prisoner graffiti that has been there for hundreds of years.